Major funding for Making Sense of the 60s was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Additional funding was provided by Sims Clothing Stores, where since 1960 an educated consumer has been our best customer. And by Tom's of Maine, a pioneer in natural personal care. Tom's of Maine and nature, a friendship of 20 years.
The American soldier, what makes him so great in combat is the mere fact that he uses his initiative. This is what makes the American soldier a greater fighting man than any foreign army that you can name. The American soldier will do anything. But the American soldier wants to know why.
I remember the problems of democracy teacher. He came into the classroom and he was all upset that there was a coup in South Vietnam. And this gentleman was killed and there's a change in government. And we looked at each other and I said, you know, where the hell's South Vietnam? You gotta be kidding me. A coup, who cares? Who would ever in our wildest dreams think that a few years later that I would be leading men into battle in South Vietnam, in Cambodia? I didn't even know where it was.
A ship is waiting for us at the dock. America has trouble to be stopped. We must stop communism in that land. Our freedom will start slipping through our hands. Kiss me goodbye and write me while I'm gone. Goodbye, my sweetheart, El Vietnam.
I was on a fast-moving train that I couldn't get off of, and I couldn't slow down. And it was taking me someplace I didn't want to go. And I was scared. And once I got there, I was taken aside, as were a lot of the soldiers, and told to write a will. It was a requirement that you write a will, so they knew where to dispose of your property should you be killed. When I wrote that will, I decided I was a dead man.
I'm a bit wounded, me, goddammit.
I think so. If I don't make it, just wish me luck, okay?
Once I entered the country, I found myself in the position of being a platoon leader for a platoon of seasoned soldiers who had been there some time before me. And the big question was not about the politics of the war, but was I going to be an effective leader and not get them hurt?
Deign, O Lord, to rescue me. Let all be put to shame and confusion who seek to snatch away my life. Deign, O Lord, to rescue me, Amen.
This whole notion of a domino theory was very real to me, that sooner or later, if the communists weren't stopped in Vietnam, sooner or later they'd get to our country. That was not, for me and for a great many people, that was not an abstraction. That's what we were fighting for in Vietnam. What do I think of it now? I mean, it's, you know, it was absurd.
Vietnam, 1965. Early moments in the single most critical event of the 1960s. Within 3 short years, this faraway war would touch off a rebellion in America. Young political activists, already concerned with issues like civil rights and free speech, would confront the government directly. At the same time, members of the counterculture would turn their backs on American society. And young blacks trapped in inner-city ghettos would rebel against an America that seemingly cared more about freedom in Southeast Asia than freedom at home. Together, these rebels would challenge America's fundamental assumptions about democracy and patriotism, and create a climate of revolution unknown in America since the Civil War. In 1964, America was optimistic about its future. Democrat Lyndon Baines Johnson was about to be elected president by one of the biggest landslides in U.S. history, thanks to a coalition of voters that included Democrats and moderate Republicans. America was united behind a liberal dream, using national laws and federal funds to solve social problems like poverty and prejudice.
Most Americans want a decent home in a decent neighborhood for all, and so do I. Most Americans want an education for every child to the limit of his ability, and so do I.
Johnson's victory convinced him the time had come to finally deliver on his party's most idealistic promise, an all-out war on poverty. He developed plans for what he called the Great Society.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
LBJ's ideas were noble in sentiment, sweeping in scope, and he put them into action with one innovative social program after another. Head Start, Medicare, VISTA, student loans, an Office of Economic Opportunity, the National Endowment for the Arts. He imagined a better society which would include everyone.
The Great Society was where everybody was educated. Everybody had all the electric power they could use. Everybody had the latest and most modern and most advanced medical care. And everybody had an adequate income. It was about that simple. He used to talk about himself hoping that history would label him the education president. You know, when he sat back and made up dreams about occupying a big place in history, that's how it came out, the education president.
I was at Harvard, which is supposedly the center of anti-Johnson, here's of people who would think Johnson is a big, gross Southerner who picks dogs up by his ears and shows off his appendicitis scar, and isn't he just too vulgar? We didn't feel that way at all. We absolutely worshipped Johnson at the beginning. And the very fact that he was a Texan and vulgar and all that was part of our worship of him. Here was this force of nature. Here was this huge personage that had come to redeem what we believed in. So the betrayal of Vietnam was all the more awful and severe because of how much faith and love, really, we invested in Lyndon Johnson.
The Vietnam War threatened to drain away time, energy, and money needed for Great Society programs. But Johnson and many others of his generation believed there was no choice, that it was necessary to send U.S. troops to thwart a dangerous and advancing enemy: international communism.
The aim of the communists is to establish control over all of Vietnam, and after that, over all of Southeast Asia.
Most Americans feared communist expansion. But from the beginning, the war was distant and confusing to the generation that would have to do most of the fighting.
I don't know. I know why we're there, but I don't know if that's if it's the right decision. But since it is, I'll do my best to whatever has to be done to stop this.
If I were handed a gun and told to go shoot Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, whoever, that this would be to me an immoral action. I don't think I could bring myself to do it.
I don't want to go to Vietnam because I don't want to get killed. If I have to, I will. It works out that way.
Vietnam was colliding with the baby boom. In 1965, the first baby boomers were turning 19, old enough to be drafted, but according to the laws of the time, not yet old enough to vote. There were only a few ways to avoid the draft legally. One was to go to college. That meant college campuses were becoming safe havens for students who would avoid or oppose the war. Although the majority of students supported the action in Vietnam, small groups began mobilizing against it. At the University of Michigan, these students and some of their professors decided to use their skills to teach what they saw as the facts of the situation: that America had involved itself wrongly in another country's civil war. Borrowing techniques they learned in the civil rights movement, they called their rally a teach-in.
The demonstration was called a teach-in because the idea originated with a group of university professors. The consensus of those who taught in from 8 o'clock last evening until 7:30 this morning is simply that the United States must cease the escalation in Vietnam, negotiate a settlement, and/or pull out.
It was the innocent birth of a new political movement.
Nobody had seen anything like it. The whole campus was one mass of people, and they stayed all night, and there was one speech after the other. There were workshops and groups. Telegrams came in, telephones came in from all over the country, from Madison, from Berkeley, from Columbia, from Harvard, you name it. All of the campuses that later on became known as student movement campuses. They said, we will have a teach-in too. This is great. We'll have another one. We'll organize it and so on. And out of that experience came the sense that, yes, you can change the country. If you do it at the right moment, if you do it in the right way, in one night, you can change the country, because that was the reality. The next day, the mood in the country was no longer the same.
In 1965, Phil Oakes was singing about doing what you had to do. And tens of thousands of young people felt what they had to do was protest United States involvement in a war they felt was wrong.
The anti-war movement almost had a spiritual, religious quality to it, if you will. There's a sense of, we're doing something morally wrong. This is wrong. We're killing people for no reason. We're using the incredible might of the American military machine to destroy these people. And there was a sense of almost a lament about what are we doing. It was like a pain. It was more motivated from pain and shame, and wanting drawing back on Hitler times and the Nazis. We don't want to be connected with something that's so evil. So there's almost a moral, spiritual, religious quality to it. The black student movement was more in your face. We're sick of you, whitey. You're racist dogs. We want our own dorm. It was much more of a energized, angry.
If the anti-war movement was in its innocent youth, the civil rights movement was entering its cynical middle age.
Why do you think that the black people are demonstrating against the war?
Because more black going over there than any other color.
Black civil rights activists were beginning to jealously guard their control of the movement. They resented the fact that their white allies could never really share the reality of black life.
I live here. This is my community. Of course you live here, but don't you respect the right of black people? Why do you think I'm their own march? Don't you? Why do you think I'm here? All right, so why can't you march in the Northwest? I'm not going to make any short of it. I'm the group, but I want to go with you.
Lyndon Johnson had involved America in two wars at once, the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty. Civil rights successes in the South and Johnson's Great Society promises had raised the expectations of the poor. But minority residents of Watts, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Chicago's South Side, and 100 other poverty-stricken urban neighborhoods continued to struggle against unfair odds. Inadequate schools, inflated retail prices, and conspiracies by realtors and bankers to keep blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. When the civil rights struggle came north, it left behind the tightly organized grassroots leadership that had defeated the Jim Crow laws. In the North, there were more complicated economic problems to overcome.
Oh, you have to have your children out here starving with nothing to eat, and you can't even get a job. Now, you just tell me, I mean, what's right?
Black people don't know how.
To many who lived here, these inner-city neighborhoods seemed like colonies, patrolled by white policemen who acted more like soldiers of an occupying army than upholders of law and order.
Because we have seen the pigs on the scene. We know what he's like. We know what he's capable of. Just being a damn pig, oinking and beating and walking the streets. I'm sick of these damn pigs walking our streets.
Out in the neighborhoods, the police were getting more resistance. Policing a ghetto neighborhood where people had been subservient, now people were standing up to police officers, asserting their rights, talking back. And for many older police officers, this was a new problem. Why don't they behave the way they always did? You know, police officer says, don't do that. Now they would say, calling police officer Whitey.
We're going to make Vietnam look like a holiday.
listen to me when I make an appeal for the Negroes, because you have no concern for the Negroes. Listen to me when I make an appeal for America. You claim you love America. Well, we love America. But you are driving us back and you are making a Samson out of us, and we are going to pull down the pillar. Should you try to pretend that I'm crazy because I want America to be saved? Is it too much to ask you to grant us human dignity? Should we be put down and shot to death for this request? If so, you can aim your guns. What the hell do you think we care about dying if you're going to deny us the right to live?
From 1964 through 1967, there were 164 inner-city rebellions, from Minneapolis to Tampa, from Boston to Los Angeles. All told, 83 people were killed, almost all of them black, shot or beaten to death by police trying to maintain law and order. Almost 30,000 were arrested. And millions, black and white, saw the smoke and heard the fire engines from their bedroom windows. Most of America had one concern. When was the government going to put an end to it?
Will the fire department get here shortly? They'll try. Hopefully they'll succeed, because next to this block of buildings is now burning the gasoline station.
It was scary. It was scary to watch on television. It was scary to know it was happening. It was scary to know that people were reverting to random violence on their own neighbor's property just because they were so frustrated and so angry that that was the only way they could get it out. That there's no solution for something like that. The political process doesn't address that level of emotionalism and that level of anger. And it seemed like the government didn't know what to do either. And that was really scary.
Well, if there's going to be another riot, I want to be prepared. And let me tell you one thing. You better not show his face in front of my house, because if it means my own life, I'd shoot him. Fear is fear, and when you got fear into you, you'll do anything. And I know what fear we had when we look up in the sky and see the sky all illuminated. It wasn't very pleasant.
Last year was pretty bad. I've been thinking about arming myself, my wife. You know, my father here, he lives next door to me. He's armed, and I know several other people who've taken the trouble to go and buy a gun. If the city or the government can't stop it, then there's going to be a little trouble in the suburbs or with normal people. So you didn't miss by much.
There was at least one place in American society where blacks and whites were fighting on the same side. The enemy in Vietnam was proving tougher than anyone had predicted, and LBJ thought he had no choice but to send more troops to reinforce those already there.
Try to picture yourself as president. You've given an order. 4,000 or 5,000 men get killed because of the order you've given. Are you going to say to yourself, I'm not talking now about making propaganda, talking to other people. Are you going to say to yourself, my God, 4,000 or 5,000 men are dead because I was a damn fool? I killed those men? No. You know what you're going to say? You're going to say those men died in a noble cause, and we've got to be sure now that the cause for which they sacrificed is not in vain. So you're going to send 10,000. You get some of those killed, and you're going to send 20,000. Get a big bunch of those killed, you're going to send 40,000.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength almost immediately. Additional forces will be needed later, and they will be sent as requested.
Young men were facing a difficult choice. Become a soldier, which meant maybe killing or being killed abroad, or avoid the war and face ostracism from people who felt it was every man's patriotic duty to defend his country.
people. Well, I don't like the war, but I think there's nothing really that we can do about it except go over there and fight.
The war could be avoided legally by obtaining a draft deferment, or illegally by refusing to be drafted or fleeing to Canada.
I had three choices. Come to Canada, go to jail, or go out and fight for something that I'd been protesting against for, better part of 2 years. And Canada seems like a awfully nice jail.
Well, I think it took more guts to come here.
The price of illegal draft evasion was high, several years in jail if you were caught. Nevertheless, a growing minority of young men opposed the war strongly enough to take that risk.
You don't own me. You don't control my life. I'll decide. That's what America's about. I get to decide whether I go or don't go. And they say, no, you got to go. And you'll do this and this and this. And you say, no, I still won't. You don't understand. I don't believe in your rules. I don't believe in your rules. I won't obey your rules.
Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go.
Draft board offices around the country, where hundreds of thousands were being marched through Army physicals, became the new focal point for protest.
You don't have to go. Please don't go. You can join our ranks. You don't have to go. Please don't go. Say no. You don't have to go. You don't have to go. You don't have to go.
Anybody that denies me my right to get up here and get literature that is offered by the United States government, because I want it. I want it. I'm the American public, Buster.
That's the American public.
You better believe in it. And what I believe in fighting for. I'm standing here a bunch of uncouth, miserable working
barbarians.
You guys think, you know?
There will be some nervous Nellies, and some who will become frustrated and bothered and break ranks under the strain. And some will turn on their leaders and on their country and on our own fighting men. There will be times of trial and tension in the days ahead that will exact the best that is in all of us. We do not seek to enlarge this war, but we shall not run out of it.
LBJ's remarks made many anti-war activists believe their peaceful demonstrations would be ignored. Some frustrated students decided the time had come to move from protests to active resistance.
I believe that it's now time for new tactics in the anti-war movement to mobilize all the support we can against the war.
It's come to this. There's nothing else to do. The picketing and all of that wasn't working. It's time for confrontation.
Relatively few protesters openly defied the law by burning their draft cards or disrupting the operation of draft induction centers. But it was these people who captured the attention of the country.
Good evening, Jerry Dunphy with tonight's big news in color. Thousands of anti-draft militants went on a hit-and-run rampage today in an all-out drive to shut down the military induction center in Oakland. Sections of downtown Oakland were paralyzed for 3 hours, and 1,000 police were needed to restore order. But in the end, the mass civil disobedience failed. The buses were delayed, but not turned away. KNXT correspondent Rick Davis reports.
One corner, the tension of the day reached a breaking point for demonstrators and law officers. A few picket signs and small rocks were thrown into the police ranks, and then came their retaliation. It was during this confusion and anger that this reporter was clubbed several times by 2 Oakland officers.
Opposition to the war existed across all ages, all classes, and all races. But the protesters who actually took to the streets were mostly middle-class college kids, just as the policemen whose job it was to control the demonstrations were mostly from blue-collar backgrounds. So dramatic battles between police and anti-war activists came to symbolize a much deeper social conflict. To many policemen and their supporters, the anti-war protesters were un-American. spoiled, naive, intellectual, pot-smoking anarchists. On the other hand, many protesters and their supporters saw the police as beer-bellied stormtroopers, living symbols of how ignorant and authoritarian America had become.
The police live by simple ideas, us and them. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Whatever we do is okay. They take a very simplistic view of the world, very conservative. The myths are constantly being reinforced. So how do they feel about they felt it's just they're assholes and we're the heroes.
Until the 60s, few of these policemen had ever faced a political protest. Their training had taught them how to use force in crowd control, not how to avoid violence. Most policemen behave professionally in a difficult and highly visible job, but a significant few let their emotions get the better of them.
I remember marching in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and marching down Mass Ave, right in front of Harvard, in fact, and having the police on either end of us with tear gas and shooting tear gas at us and running like crazy against, and running in the direction of the police in one direction, taking a left down Brattle Street or one of the streets off of Mass Ave away from these folks, and looking back at police catching people, and billy clubs being thrown around and hit, and screams. Strange time to watch that. I mean, it's the first time you'd ever seen a policeman do something to a white college kid.
We shall win the war. We shall win the war someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I know that
Attempts to destroy the protests with force backfired.
Time sets us in motion, can't you see?
For every young demonstrator tear-gassed or billy-clubbed, 1,000 more, shocked by how the riot squads were treating people just like themselves, took to the streets in radical defiance of the war.
And sideways for a while.
As they watched policemen struggle with a hippie counterculture, ghetto rebellions, and a growing anti-war movement, many Americans shared the cops' disgust with what looked like one frightening revolutionary mob. But the anti-war protesters were succeeding in one way. They were focusing the entire country's attention on what America was doing in Vietnam.
This is going to be a methodical search, house by house, village by village, as we move north. As you can see, we're looking for tunnels, caves, anything where the Viet Cong may hide. We've been chasing these VCs since 8 o'clock this morning. It's now about 25 minutes until 3 o'clock. These Viet Cong are elusive. You can't see them. All you can do is hear the bullets as they come at you.
The Vietnam War itself was elusive for Americans, despite the fact that it was on the evening news almost every night. Part of the problem was that the film coming out of Vietnam conflicted with what the Johnson administration was saying about the war. LBJ and his people said America was winning. The TV reports were less convincing. The result came to be called the credibility gap.
Very, very encouraged. I've never been more encouraged during my entire almost 4 years in country. I think we're making real progress. Everybody is very optimistic that I know of.
The funny thing about Vietnam is that I was getting Time magazine every week. It came in the mail. I could read about my war even as I sat in the middle of it. And I would read about what Lyndon Johnson would say and what McNamara would say and what Rusk would say. And I could look around and see that, I don't know what war they're talking about, but that's not what's going on here.
January 1968. North Vietnamese forces launch over 100 simultaneous attacks on South Vietnam, catching U.S. forces by surprise. When these images started coming back to America, many began to wonder if victory in Vietnam was worth the price, the destruction of the country America was fighting to save.
Of course, we weren't as knowledgeable as we are today about, the business of war. We thought wars were totally a moral thing at the time. Why didn't we end that war? This little country can't beat us, and then the pictures on TV of our boys getting killed and the atrocities on both sides. Nobody could understand why the government wouldn't finish this off. It's so easy to do.
Bring these boys home. What are we doing over there? French couldn't beat them. We couldn't beat them.
Yeah, that's
What are we doing there? Yet we beat the whole world, World War II, supplied the whole world. Boom, we went through like nothing. This little swamp we couldn't take. Then my nephew gets killed there. Oh, boy, I tell you, I could really rile up when I start talking about this,
We were brought up to never question authority. Isn't that true? People of our age group. And the government was right, and the policeman was right, and the priest was right, and Mom and Dad were right. The school board was right. Anybody that was in authority knew what was best and how we should think, and they told us how to think.
But I never told my dad he was crazy.
Shouldn't I let my government know that I think they're crazy? I think they are insane, really. This is an insane thing we're doing to my government.
How will you say it?
Well, how should I say it?
In a proper manner.
I think an 18-year-old owes something to this country. To serve.
For what? For what?
In backyards and bar rooms across the country, Americans debated the pros and cons of a distant war.
I've listened. I've waited and asked for good reasons as to why we should be there, and I haven't heard one.
Well, I've heard one, that communism is a dynamic philosophy, and unless it's stopped, it continues to grow. And I, for one, would rather send my son to fight, if need be, than have the country taken over by an atheistic philosophy.
Yeah, but the United States in particular. Do you really think that we're going to be invaded by the Vietnamese? That Vietnam is going to invade the United States?
Not the Vietnamese, but Red China.
Red China.
We think that anybody who's committed to democracy in this country now is a radical, because democracy is a radical idea here.
Certainly, it was personal for me. These ideas were not just speeches in the forum. The pain of it all became most acute in terms of my relationship with my dad. He couldn't understand why I was so upset that with a wife and 3 kids and a pretty little house on Sunnyside Street, I would throw that all over, quit my good job, which to him was a great job. That was a step up. He had worked in a factory all his life, and here his son was white collar with a college education. That to him was terrific. Why complain about that? Why throw that over to run off with these strange political gypsies who are into something they call the movement? It led to an enormous rupture in our relationship.
America has heard the bugle call, and you know it involves us one and all.
Like a civil war, brother turned against brother, family against family. Old friendships broke up, like the one between contractors Roy and Wanda Knight and their longtime employee, Lloyd Smith.
Well, Lloyd had worked for us for about 12 years, I think. And we had children that were growing up in the school system together. We had children that were friends with each other. They were almost the same ages. So it was sad for us when the Vietnam War came along and we had such different views on what was patriotism and what was the right stand to take.
I was working for a man that had a son that was one of the protesters. And I didn't feel right about taking money from somebody that weren't willing to support our country. And I was proud that our own boys were going And it got to be the place where I resented the fact that I was helping him make a living and my boys were going off to war.
I think if our son hadn't been a conscientious objector, you know, it might have been different too. But Bob was over there in the war, and our son was here, safe. And it just, it really hurt. And then when Bob was killed in the war, it was very hard for all of us, I think.
At the time, you're full of grief. The world stops for about 6 months. You can't function, you don't think.
Just live day by day. I know every night for, 6 weeks, I'd go in the bathroom, sit down on the floor, cry my heart out.
Knowing what I know now, and if I had another boy to go in a situation like Vietnam, I'd help him get away any way I could. As far as a situation like that, maybe the protesters were right.
After years of arguments and personal sacrifice, roughly half the country still wanted to win the war, whatever it took. The other half just wanted it to be over. An even split in public opinion over an issue as fundamental as war threatens a country's stability. And when a nation is fighting with itself, it cannot win.
You would have been working, you would have had time to grow that there hair on top of you.
Sure I would.
No, you wouldn't have. No, I don't want to read. I don't want to read. I'm an educated American.
Find out what it's about.
I gotta find out what it's about. I was in World War II, fella, and I served 3 years. I know what it's about.
They got the nerve to walk around here with peace flowers on them. At the end of this parade, they should gather them all together and put it on the grave of a soldier in Vietnam that got killed today. This is a disgrace.
Where do you end up? Why are you trying to close up the induction?
Because I have a son that's going to go into the army. If somebody keeps on coming up to you with a damn gun, what are you going to do? Yeah, sit back. They teach him to fight and kill over there. You're going to sit back. I'm here and kill the same thing because they're talking and kill. You said to me, a black man that sent over to Vietnam with a gun. What should he do? Isn't a white man sent over there too? Well, what the hell would he do? I asked you if he should defend himself at home here too with a gun. That's what I asked. You bet your damn life if they keep on fucking him. If they keep on fucking him, yes. Shoot the hell out of him.
If you had fallen asleep in 1964 and awakened in 1968, you might have had trouble believing you were still living in the same country.
Against you, then fuck them.
There was many great arguments. But one of them was between the liberals and the radicals. The liberals wanted to work within the system and change it, and the radicals wanted to stand outside and hammer on the walls so they come down. And I thought everybody on our side was nuts. What were these people doing, arguing with each other? My way is right, my way is right. It was clear that nothing was going to budge unless you pushed from both sides, okay? Unless there were people in the streets yelling and people in the offices listening.
Johnson's Democratic administration was increasingly under attack from all sides, from radicals, conservatives, even his former liberal allies.
Is all very nice, but it's also a lot of liberal bullshit.
The coalition that had given Lyndon Johnson his enormous victory 4 years earlier was rapidly disintegrating.
It's very difficult for someone who didn't live through that period to understand that months, not simply years, but months make a difference. What it felt like in January of 68 on a college campus bears precious little relationship to what it felt like in December of 68. You've moved politically and culturally light years from those positions. There is simply that much groping for a new ground on which to build any kind of consensus politically or culturally. And frankly, it never comes. It just continues to spin out of control in that fashion.
A nonviolent response has certain kinds of presumptions I don't have to believe. It presumes, in effect, that we're dealing with moral men.
We were debating the Vietnam War, and I was debating the pro-United States position against a fellow who, in fact, later served on the city council in Madison in front of 400 or 500 people. I presented my case. He simply got up and said that when the revolution came, people like me would be shot.
I felt that street fighting and disrupting life as normal and being on the evening news going, "Ah, your stinking war," was good. I thought that it was not going to go away, and we were not going to go away, and they were not going to get away with it. I mean, really, it was not going to be pretty. And all these damn liberals, I had grown up with liberals, watching liberals say, "Well, we're opposed to the war." Well, put your money where your mouth, do something. And they wouldn't. So we had to.
I remember back at the bar in our trucking depot talking to other drivers, and we were just so angry. And not that we supported the war or any of this, but we were sort of, this was all making trouble for a Democratic administration that was delivering more progress, more work. Unemployment was lower, growth was higher, and the kids didn't seem to get it. They seemed to think this could last forever.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson knew that if he ran for the presidency again, he would destroy his party. Johnson wanted to pass on his power to his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, but Humphrey was also tainted by a war many Democrats were turning against.
The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. I don't know about you. I ain't gonna study war no more.
Dr. Martin Luther King, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the nonviolent civil rights movement, was now using his persuasive moral influence against the war.
Martin was becoming a nuisance. Martin wasn't this lovable, cuddly bear anymore that white America wanted to embrace. And you could sense that he was becoming another danger to himself. That enemy was out there. In one moment, just one moment, it all ended. That shot affected America. It affected black America in such a way, I can't begin to express to people what happened. I know how I felt. I mean, the tears would not stop. And Martin was dead. They killed Martin. And first thing that jumped to my mind was clearly what was jumping everywhere. White America killed Martin. White America killed Martin. And God damn it, you're gonna pay. You're gonna pay for this.
Martin Luther King's assassination in April was followed by riots in 126 cities. 46 died, hundreds were injured, 21,000 were arrested. In Washington, federal troops guarded the White House. A machine gun post protected the Capitol.
They see us spend billions on armaments while poverty and ignorance continue at home. They see us willing to fight a war for freedom in Vietnam, but unwilling to fight with 1/100th the money or force or effort to secure freedom in Mississippi or Alabama or the ghettos of the North. And they see, perhaps most disturbing of all, that they are remote from the decisions of policy.
I want to introduce my wife to you, to the candidate.
Shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Senator Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of the assassinated president, stepped up his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. He would oppose Hubert Humphrey as a stop-the-war candidate. Kennedy was a strong voice for change within the Democratic Party and had won the hearts of old guard liberals, blacks and Hispanics, even some political radicals. By June 1968, Robert Kennedy was close to winning the nomination and possibly reuniting a divided America.
Robert Kennedy, for me, was the last politician in America who could bring together rich and poor, who could talk to the whole nation, and had the moral outrage to challenge people in their complacency. And that excited me. The California primary was in June, and I remember going to bed, and Robert Kennedy had won the primary, and it was clear he was going to win. All the projections said he was going to win.
Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot. And another man. I hope they can get the gun out of his hand. Be very careful. Get the gun. Get the gun. Get the gun. His hand is frozen. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to. Get his thumb.
My mother woke me up the next morning and said Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. It all fell apart. Everything had fallen apart. I really believed. I really thought he was going to be the next president of the United States. And I can't ever remember a time of feeling less hopeful about the country or feeling sadder. I remember a day or two later heading off to St. Patrick's Cathedral, where Robert Kennedy was lying in state. I waited 5-6 hours just to walk past his coffin and talking to people in the crowd and hearing the crowd. The level of sadness, the horror, the lack of belief that this could possibly be happening.
Quadrennial Convention of the Democratic Party is now called in session.
Most delegates to this convention do not know that thousands of young people are being beaten in the streets of Chicago.
The spectators who were just spectators before have attacked the police. The police are moving the people away. They're swinging wildly. Some of the people are falling, being trampled. I see a policeman picking up someone who is apparently injured and stepped out. They're throwing rocks and bottles at policemen now.
In 1968, the rebellions and the disillusionment that had been growing since the decade began exploded in a cataclysm, the effects of which still reverberate throughout American society.
Something so valuable, something of such immense spiritual value was taken out of the American people in 1968 with those two assassinations that I think we were unable to pass on anything of lasting spiritual or moral value to the succeeding generation because we didn't have it anymore.